James Hohmann's Daily 202 newsletter is the go-to source for sharp analysis on politics and power in Washington. And our 202 Live event series gives us the opportunity to bring to the stage in-depth interviews with the newsmakers who are shaping policy around our country. Today, you're going to hear from Senator Bernie Sanders on a wide range of issues, from his thoughts on our current political climate and the midterm elections to his future political plans. And in a couple of weeks, on June 27th, we'll host Republican Congressman Steve Scalise. So before we get started this morning, I just want to encourage any of you who have not already signed up for the Daily 202 to go to wapo.st/daily202, put in your email address. We've made it very easy for you this morning. Okay, I would now like to welcome to the stage James Hohmann and Senator Bernie Sanders. Thank you.
Great group. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Senator, for coming. Bernie Sanders obviously doesn't need much of an introduction.
You know, I never get an introduction. People always say that, but thank you.
But in case you forgot, he was the mayor of Burlington, Vermont. 16 years in the House, is seeking his third term in the Senate, and really started a political revolution, which isn't one of the necessarily on the resume, but have changed American politics in a lot of ways, and changed the Democratic Party in a lot of ways without being a member of it. We have a lot to cover. If you are watching either on our live stream or in the audience, you can send questions that'll pop up on this iPad. You just tweet the question for Senator Sanders with the hashtag 202Live. I'll post some of them later in our discussion. I want to start with politics and then talk about policy. And there's obviously a lot going on every day. But we're speaking the morning after the primary in California, the nation's most populous state, but also 7 other states, the biggest primary day of the year. They're still counting ballots in California this morning. You had some wins and some losses in Iowa. Pete D'Alessandro, who was a key player in your Iowa campaign, 2016, did not win the nomination for a House seat. Kathy Glasson, who you didn't endorse, but our revolution didn't win the nomination for governor. But you had also in Iowa, Deidre DeGear got the Democratic nomination for Secretary of State in Iowa. So some gains on the candidate side, but also you're seeing a lot of candidates who aren't necessarily running as Bernie Sanders candidates embrace your policy ideas. So I was hoping you could react to what we saw last night.
What we tried to do in creating what we call a political revolution was 2 things. Number one is speak to the American people about the most important issues impacting their lives as working people, lower income people, middle class people, and demand that candidates have the courage to take on the oligarchy in this country of a handful of billionaires who exercise enormous power over our economic and political system, and adopt ideas, deal with ideas that make sense to working people. And to do that, you must deal with income and wealth inequality, the moral unacceptability of 3 people owning more wealth than the bottom half of the American people, of incredible political power in the hands of billionaires who are spending hundreds of millions of dollars trying to buy candidates, of the fact that we are the only major country on earth not guaranteeing health care to all people, of the fact that you have workers. I was just out, I don't know if you know this, in California over the weekend, talking to workers at Disney. Here you have a corporation that made $9 billion in profit last year, signed a contract with its CEO for over $400 million over a 4-year period. I talked to workers who have literally slept in their cars, don't have enough food to eat, are working 7 days a week because they're getting starvation wages in a company which pays its CEO over 4 years $400 million, makes $9 billion in profit. So those are the issues. How do you create an economy that works for all, not just the few? And I'm very proud that many of the ideas that we talked about in the 2016 campaign, as you indicate, are now ideas yesterday and previously that candidates running for Congress or Senate are talking about.
And we talked a couple weeks ago because there was a headline on one of the Daily 202s that said something about the far left, and it identified things like the $15 minimum wage, tuition-free college, single payer. And you and I talked about how those things actually have pluralities or majorities support. Is that a shift? Are Americans sort of embracing those? How have they become?
I think what we managed to do is take ideas which the American people thought were fine and bring them out into the mainstream. Is it a radical extremist idea that the United States join every other major country on earth and guarantee health care to all people as a right? Is that really a far left idea? I live in Burlington, Vermont, 50 miles away from the Canadian border. And for decades, every man, woman, and child has had health care, quality health care in Canada as a right. Is it a radical idea to say that if you work 40 hours a week, you don't live in poverty? And the majority of the American people now believe that $15 an hour minimum wage is what a living wage is about.
What's driving that shift? What's causing people?
I think we have managed a whole bunch of factors, and there's not one, but I think what you have seen for the last 40 years is a middle class in decline. Last year, in the midst of an economy where unemployment is quite low, we have seen zero inflation accounted for wage gains for non-supervisory workers. And people are looking around and they're seeing, the head of Amazon seeing his wealth increase by $275 million a day, and they're saying, what about me? I'm working 2 or 3 jobs. So I think people are kind of saying enough is enough. Let's have health care for all. Let's have living wages. Let's make public colleges and universities tuition free so every kid in this country has the right to get a higher education and make it into middle class. In my state and all over this country, we drive on roads which are falling apart. We have a rail system far behind the rest of the world. Why are we not investing in rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure and creating millions of decent paying jobs? Why do we have more people in jail in the United States, over 2 million people, than China has? So I think people are beginning to ask the hard questions, and you're seeing a lot of people getting involved in the political process, and many of them running for office for the first time.
Your 2016 campaign manager, Jeff Weaver, wrote a book that came out last month called How Bernie Won. You're obviously not in the White House, but
obviously.
I guess is one of the reasons that people like Pete D'Alessandro aren't winning these primaries because other Democrats are embracing these ideas, and I mean, what's going on?
You have never heard of an instance where one individual says, vote for James Holman. Oh my God, yes, and you win by a landslide. We have had a very good record, actually. Our revolution has helped elect many, many people. We're separate from our revolution, have had the same. Just the other day, Washington Post reported that Ben Jealous is now in first place.
Right.
Well, Ben is doing, it's not me. Ben is running a great campaign. And
this is the Democrat running for governor in Maryland.
Right. And I hope very much he's come a long, long way. We worked with Randall Woodfin, who is now the mayor of Birmingham, Alabama. Our revolution worked with Shaka Lumumba, who's now mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. I campaigned for John Fetterman, who pulled off a big upset as lieutenant governor.
Defeating an incumbent lieutenant governor.
Right, in Pennsylvania. So you win some and you lose some. But what's most important, the media looks at this or that race. That's not the most important thing. The most important thing, and what we try very hard to do, is bring millions of more people, young people, working people, into the political process. You remember the election that was held in Virginia, the special election. Everyone focused on the governor's race. Important. People missed the point that a lot of young people were running for office, first time women, people of color, gay people running for office. That's the kind of political revolution. Now, here's the last point I would make on this subject. In 2014, not widely discussed, when Republicans won a landslide victory all across this country, we had the lowest voter turnout in Vermont, all over this country, than any time since World War II. You remember that?
I do.
Over 60% of the American people did not vote at all. So to me, what my job is to get Americans involved, get them out to vote, to run for office, to demand that we have an election system which reflects the needs of ordinary people rather than billionaire campaign contributors. And I think in that regard, we're having some success.
One of the reasons the other side does have an advantage is the money advantage.
Yeah.
And our revolution was set up as an independent entity. You obviously can't coordinate directly with them, but they've just set up a PAC that you legally could raise money for. Is that something you would do? Would you raise money for our revolution, even if?
Well, let me take that one step at a time. But I think the issue here, and maybe, we can talk about healthcare, and we can talk about education, and we can talk about women's rights. At the end of the day, my friends, the most important issue is campaign finance reform. Because so long as you continue to have a handful of billionaires like the Koch brothers, Sheldon Adelson, and others who can dump huge amounts of money into a Senate race, a congressional race, a governor's race, we're not going to have the kind of democracy that this country deserves. If you look at what goes on in the Senate where I live, or in the House, what you find is that virtually every major piece of legislation that comes to the floor is paid for by wealthy and powerful special interests. And in fact, in many cases, whether it's trying to throw 32 million people off of health insurance or give tax breaks to billionaires, it is exactly the opposite of what the American people want. So we have to deal with campaign finance reform. The dilemma, obviously, is you can say, oh, well, and I ran without a super PAC, and that's the way I will always run. Our campaign was dependent upon several million small individual contributions averaging $27. The dilemma out there is people can say, well, I did it, and I will always do that. But, people say, well, it's kind of unilateral disarmament. The Koch brothers pouring in huge amounts of money. So.
Do you have confidence in our revolution?
Yes, I do. I think Nina Turner has done a fantastic job. You can criticize anybody that you want. Nobody I know is perfect. Our revolution is not perfect. But in the last 2 years, not a long period of time, they have started 600 chapters all across this country. And I think they have gotten just all kinds of different people, younger people primarily, people of color, into the political process. That's exactly what they have to do. And I think, I've traveled the country with Nina. I intend to continue doing that. She is just a passionate and extremely bright person, and I have a lot of confidence in Nina.
I want to go back to something you just said on the policy front. I have more political questions later, but one of the striking things recently was when they rolled back Dodd-Frank, the bill that was passed to prevent another financial crisis. 17 Democrats voted for that piece of legislation, even more in the House. Are things like that going to happen until there's campaign finance reform? Is that an example of a special?
I think that is. That is. At the end of the day, it's not complicated. Politics really is not. Look, people disagree. That's called democracy. That's a good thing. Let's treat each other in a civil way. You disagree with me, and that's fine. But at the end of the day, you want a government which represents ordinary people, the needs of ordinary people, rather than the needs of a handful of billionaires. And when folks say, well, I need that vote from you, and you want campaign contributions, you want help from my super PAC, I will expect you to vote to deregulate Wall Street. Well, people will do that, unfortunately.
You mentioned the kind of the oligarchy. You even mentioned Disney. Bob Iger, the CEO who got the deal you talked about,
I didn't mention Jeff Bezos. You all heard that?
Yeah.
I wouldn't do that here. I don't want to embarrass
right. Bob Iger, Mark Cuban, Howard Schultz, Sheryl Sandberg. You have all these sort of millionaire, billionaire, plutocrat Democrats who are, Tom Steyer, thinking about getting involved in the process. Some of them probably share your views on a lot of issues, but can also, aren't necessarily proven progressives and have the ability to cut these huge checks. Do you worry about kind of we can talk about the Koch brothers and Sheldon Adelson all day, but that we're seeing more of these people emerge on the left?
The truth is, and it is, and I see among my colleagues, good people, spending half, and they'll be the first to admit it to you, spending half of their lives not dealing with their constituents, not studying up on the issues. They're on the damn phone, and they hate it.
Yeah.
But that's the system that we are in right now. We are moving toward a system where, especially if you are in a large state, you're going to have to be either dependent upon billionaire contributors or be a billionaire yourself. Does anybody really think this is what American democracy is supposed to be about? So yes, I do. Look, there are billionaires out there who are very decent people, who are smart people, who are well-intentioned people. But they shouldn't have the right to run for office any more than a working stiff who is also decent and bright, but can't afford to raise the millions of dollars that is needed for a campaign. So yeah, I do have real concerns about that.
Back to politics. I want to kind of close the loop on some 2018 stuff. New York, your home state. You were born in Brooklyn.
Yes.
The chairman of the DNC, Tom Perez, endorsed Andrew Cuomo, who's locked in a pretty competitive primary with Cynthia Nixon. Our Revolution has endorsed Cynthia Nixon. Do you think that was a mistake for the chair of the DNC?
Absolutely.
And does it make it harder to trust that progressive candidates in 2020 will get a fair shake when they're wading into primaries like this?
It does. Look, let us also be clear. Maybe I'm the only person here who will tell you this, but you got Democrats up here who will tell you, oh, Democratic Party is God's gift to the human race. Republicans will tell you the same thing. Look, there is massive discontent with the political system. People don't vote. People often hold their noses and they vote. And I think, by and large, especially in the Democratic Party, what I have said, as you indicated, I am an independent who has caucused with the Democrats, for my whole political life here in Washington, is open the doors of the Democratic Party. Welcome working people, welcome young people in, welcome idealism in. So when you have the head of the DNC, and I've worked okay with Perez on some areas, and I'll mention that in a moment, but to endorse one candidate over the other is not what the chair of the DNC should be doing. Now, one of the areas that we have worked on, we will see what happens, man, and this will be a very big deal. Right now, as you know, when I ran, you had many super delegates, almost all of whom ended up supporting Hillary Clinton. And I think there is a widespread understanding that's just not right. And in fact, you had super delegates voting for Clinton in states that I won pretty handsomely. Right. And I think there is a general feeling that that does not make a lot of sense. And now there is agreement among Tom Perez and a lot of the Clinton people, as well as our people, who came together and what Clinton and I formed what we called a Democratic Unity Reform Committee, to say that we should substantially reduce the number of superdelegates, actually by about 70%. Some people think we should eliminate them all, and I could certainly support that. Will that happen? Well, we will see. Pay attention to that.
Right.
And then you got other issues. In New York State, we talk about voter suppression, one of the great problems of our country. It's not just money in politics. You got Republican governors and attorneys general all over this country trying to make it harder for poor people or people of color to vote. How outrageous is that? Go to New York State and find out that if you're going to participate in the Democratic primary, you have got to be registered as a Democrat 6 months before that primary. And when I ran in 2016, 3 million people in New York State were ineligible to vote. Does that make any sense? No. So those are the kinds of hurdles and obstacles that I think Democratic leadership has got to change.
So the vice chair of the DNC who ran against Perez, Keith Ellison, big supporter of yours in 2016, represents my home state of Minnesota. He just announced yesterday that he's running for attorney general, which was really striking to me because he's someone who, if Democrats win the House, is in a position to have quite a lot of power, but has decided to try and be attorney general, which is not a sure thing. Obviously attorney generals are on the front lines of the resistance. They're able to sue the administration. But what does it say? I mean, you served 16 years in the House. What does it say do you support Ellison doing this? Do you think it's a good idea?
Keith is a very good friend of mine. Yeah. And I'm sorry that he was not elected chair of the DNC. Yeah. I certainly will support Keith. I just talked to him yesterday. My guess is, and we didn't speak for a long time, is that Keith, and I know this for a fact, is keenly interested in the issue of criminal justice and the need to reform a system which is terribly broken. And he wants to be, as an attorney general of a large state like Minnesota, he can play a leading role in that. He's very concerned about immigration reform. And I think would use that office to deal with some of the horrific things that the Trump administration is doing.
Great. Let's transition to some policy. The reason we're actually you're here in Washington.
Yes.
Mitch McConnell announced yesterday that he's basically canceling August recess. He's going to allow 1 week. Good idea? Bad idea?
Well, it's very clear. I think everybody knows why he's doing it. He is scared to death that Republicans, and he's scared for good reason, that the Republicans might lose control over the Senate. So what he wants to do, given the fact that there are a lot more Democratic incumbents in the Senate than Republicans, I think Dean Heller may not be all that enthusiastic about that decision, but he wants to keep Democrats in Washington rather than campaigning. I think that's, it's pretty petty, but that's the way it is. So, would I rather be back in Vermont than in Washington, D.C. in August? Yeah, I would.
Let's talk about trade. You obviously have in the past been very vocal against some of these trade deals.
Yep.
Trump's trying to renegotiate NAFTA.
Yep.
We're now in this trade war. What do you make of what's going on? And obviously you sort of diagnosed the same problem, but I think maybe would have had a different.
Well, here's the reality: is that for many decades, Republicans and Democrats allowed this country into trade agreements which benefited corporate America, the pharmaceutical industry, Wall Street, but were disastrous for working people. I believe in trade. Trade's a good thing. But I do not believe in unfettered free trade. And you have large corporations saying, why do I want to pay an American worker 15, 18, 20 bucks an hour when I can go to Vietnam and pay people, I don't know, they're getting their $1 an hour or $2 an hour. Why would I want to? Is that free trade? No, it's not free trade. And that is what we have seen in NAFTA and what we have seen in permanent normal trade relations with China. So I think we have to have trade agreements which protect our environment, which protect working people, which respect democratic rights, the right to form a union. I remember some years ago, it was almost too funny to believe. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce was opposed to liberalization of labor law in China where workers could form independent unions. They liked the idea that workers in China couldn't form an independent union and stand up for their rights. So that's absurd. So I think we have to negotiate trade agreements that work for American workers.
The values you just outlined seem like things that wouldn't be priorities for the president. I don't know how closely you're following the NAFTA renegotiation, but the tariffs, the back and forth.
I think you have to look at, the idea of going into a trade war with Canada does not make a lot of sense to me. I think you might want to take a much harder look at the cheating that China does, for example, currency manipulation, their stealing of intellectual property rights, etc. But I would not, the idea of going into a trading war with historical allies where workers are paid as much or more than our workers are paid does not make a lot of sense to me.
I want to talk about social media. You're obviously you have huge followings on all the platforms, Twitter and Facebook, but in the past couple of months, there's been kind of new, fresh scrutiny that maybe was long overdue of platforms like Facebook and the respect for user privacy.
Yes.
Mark Zuckerberg obviously appeared before the Senate, said a bunch of things. Then we sort of public attention moved on as it always does, right. And then just this week there have been half a dozen stories that sort of actually in some ways contradict or undercut Zuckerberg's testimony. What can Congress do? Is Congress going to do anything to deal with
that? Thanks for asking that question. And just let me break the news to you all, and I think you already know that. Every website that you visit, every email that you send, every phone call that you make, there is some entity that is recording that. And it shocks me, quite frankly, how little the American people have said, hey, you know what? I'm an American citizen. I am entitled to live my life and make the phone calls that I want or visit the websites that I want, to read the books that I want without Big Brother, whether it is the United States government or increasingly corporate America, knowing everything I do. People know where you are right now. They know where you are shopping. They have access to your bank records. They have access to your health care records. Are you comfortable with that? And too often I'm hearing people say, hey, you know what? I'm not a terrorist. Government wants to listen to my phone calls. That's fine. I think that's pretty pathetic. All right? I think we have got to, and now you ask me about Congress. Congress is so far behind the explosion of technology that it's, we have got to start moving aggressively and say that everything being equal, you're entitled to your privacy. The whole world does not have to know everything about you. So I think we're making some progress with Facebook in terms of the kinds of political ads that they will now accept. But that is just a small step forward.
And even in California, there were stories about people basically running attack ads on Facebook and not being in this new system. I mean, it seems
right. So
small ball.
But this whole issue of technology far outpacing public policy to protect privacy rights is a huge issue which we have got to focus a lot more.
So, I mean, is this something that, in some ways, the companies want regulation? If they can control it and design it and control the bodies that oversee it. And in other ways, I mean, what do you think that framework looks like? Is it a new law? Is it a new?
It's going to have to be significant legislation, and we're working. I mean, this is so complicated.
Right.
This is not going to be a 2-page piece of legislation. But the bottom line now is the information about your life, James, is valuable to some company.
Yeah.
Who will then tell you what kind of car you need to buy, right, and what kind of vacation you need to go on. And we have to decide as a nation whether what you do with your life is something that should be sold to companies who will exploit that information.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to reiterate that you can tweet any question for Senator Sanders to just tweet it with the hashtag 202Live. And we'll start asking some of these questions. The one that has popped up is from Aubrey on Twitter, which is, what changes, if any, have you noticed in Congress since the beginning of the Me Too movement? Do you think that enough has been done about combating sexual harassment in this country?
Well, Congress will shortly pass the most far-reaching legislation, so that if a member of Congress harasses or worse, an employee, that member will be held accountable in a much more severe way than has ever been the case. Truthfully, Congress has been quite weak on it. So I think consciousness on this issue has grown. There will be legislation passed, and I think we are beginning to make some progress, not enough.
Bill Clinton's been out there this week talking about his new book, and has gotten questions about Monica Lewinsky. He was on Stephen Colbert last night trying to clean up an interview with MSNBC. You obviously opposed impeachment back in the 90s. Kirsten Gillibrand recently said that he should have resigned. Do you agree with her?
I don't want to look back. I mean, the times have changed.
Yeah.
The times have changed. I mean, I think if Bill Clinton was sitting here, he would tell you that what he did was profoundly wrong. I think it has haunted that family forever. But I'm not going to go back into the early 1990s and cast judgment on that.
Was it a mistake for Al Franken to get sort of pushed out by the caucus?
Al is a friend of mine,
Yeah.
and we miss him very, very much. And I think, I guess what the issue is about is we have got to be aggressive in making certain that women, when they are on the job, feel safe and comfortable on the job and are able to not fear going public or going to a supervisor and saying, this guy is harassing me. On the other hand, if somebody, says a dumb joke, has to be put in an overall context.
Right. On foreign policy, North Korea summit coming up next week.
Yep.
President going to Singapore. What do you make of these talks? Are you nervous about Donald Trump in a room with Kim Jong-un?
Yeah, actually, look, North Korea is an isolated, authoritarian regime which is incredibly cruel, which has allowed its children to starve to death in order to put money into the nuclear weapons program. They have nuclear weapons. Their missile system has significantly advanced, and we should be very fearful of them. This is an issue that should concern not only Asia and our allies in South Korea and Japan, China, but the whole world. If Trump is able to negotiate the cessation of nuclear weapons and the denuclearization of North Korea, that will be a major step forward for the world, and he would deserve credit for that. And I hope that that is the success. What we don't want to see is Trump come back and then boasting about this, that, and the other thing without having accomplished anything significant. But certainly, I think the whole world hopes that these negotiations are successful and that a very dangerous regime can be left without nuclear weapons.
On Israel, you were one of the few people in Washington, the leaders, to speak out about Israel and its treatment of the Gazans during the protests on the day that the U.S. Embassy was moved. Why hasn't there been more pushback from Washington in either party on that issue?
Well, it gets back to the issue we talked about a few minutes ago, and that is, I think, money in politics. Look, here is the reality. I am Jewish. I lived in Israel when I was a young man for a while. I think I have a cousin who's living in Israel. I absolutely believe in the need for Israel to be independent, to be free, to be secure from terrorist attacks. I believe that very, very strongly. But I also believe that when you have almost 2 million people living in Gaza, where the water is filthy, where youth unemployment is at 60%, where people can't even leave the area, that is unacceptable. I also believe that Netanyahu has torpedoed the goal of a two-state solution by building more and more settlements. And I think what the proper role of the United States of America would be, which supplies a whole lot of weapons to people all over that area, not just Israel, but to Saudi Arabia, another despotic regime that apparently does not get a lot of criticism here. I think the United States has got to sit down and say, look, Palestinians are entitled to basic human rights. Israel is absolutely entitled to exist in independence and freedom. Let's work that out. Trump, and I think that requires a level, an even-handed policy in the Middle East. And we don't have that now. I'll tell you what, James, frightens me very, very much. Going a little bit beyond Israel, we have been at war, and we sometimes forget that, in Afghanistan now for 17 years, in Iraq for 15 years. We have a president here who has allied himself with the despotic regime in Saudi Arabia, which is now at war in Yemen. And let me be very honest with you, I fear very much about perpetual warfare. I'm in an Orwellian situation where we're always at war. You got the military-industrial complex with huge power. The Congress, against my vote, voted to increase military spending by $165 billion. They're talking now about tactical nuclear weapons on submarines. So, I think we have a lot to be concerned about. And I think we have to take a hard look at what our foreign policy is. What does the war on terrorism mean? Are we always going to be at war? Or is there an alternative approach? This is not easy stuff. I don't mean to suggest that it is. But I do worry about this country being engaged in perpetual warfare at great expense to the American people and to the world.
And there are stories this week about the national security team actively considering wading deeper into Yemen and getting more involved.
And not to mention the possibility of a war with Iran. We're going to bring forth the Department of Defense authorization bills coming up. And I'm going to bring forth an amendment, which I doubt will get a vote. And this is my amendment. It will suggest that 0.1% of the defense budget go to student and cultural exchange programs around the world. 0.1% would be $700 million so that American kids could go abroad, that kids from around the world can come into our classrooms, that people in the world can get to know each other rather than continue what Trump's effort is to try to divide us up and teach us hatred. So 0.1%. Let's see if we can get a vote on that.
What's interesting is when President Trump ran in 2016, he actually got a lot of applause in some of the places for talking about ending perpetual war. He said,
exactly.
We're going to bring the troops home from Afghanistan. What happened? Is it just the...
Well, it happens. It's what always happens with Trump. He lies all of the time. And he lied to the American people. Your point is right. I often point out, as all of you remember, that Trump said, I will provide health care to everybody, cheaper, better. Well, then he ended up supporting a legislation to throw 32 million people off of health care. I will bring about tax reform, but it will not benefit the wealthy. Well, 83% of the benefits go to the top 1%. And then he talked about regime change, criticized Clinton because she supported the war in Iraq, not Donald Trump. But then, he brings John Bolton on, who in fact was one of the architects of the war in Iraq. So, I mean, I think you have a president who doesn't, and I say this not happily, not in a partisan way. I don't think he knows too much about policy. I don't think he's particularly interested in policy. I think he often responds to the last person who got his ear. But I worry very much about the aggressiveness to try to, obviously undermine not only the Paris climate change accord, but also the Iranian nuclear deal. And all of this tells me that, this guy may be into perpetual warfare or maybe even worse, a war with Iran.
Let's talk about 2019, because we're getting some questions popping up here. You obviously just outlined a bunch of critiques of Trump. There are a lot of progressive activists who would love to impeach the president. I know you've talked about this some, but is that a direction you think it makes sense to go? We obviously don't know where the...
I'm a member of the United States Senate, and my constitutional responsibility would be to vote if the House were to bring forth impeachment charges. How can I give you a judgment now and then say I'm objective about it? Look, I think Trump in so many ways has been a disaster in the United States, giving tax breaks to billionaires, trying to throw so many people off of health care, wanting to cut back on nutrition programs for low-income pregnant women, lying every day. But, impeachment, I take the Constitution seriously. And we have an investigation going on right now by Mr. Mueller. And when his investigation is completed and his findings are made public, was there collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia? Then we can begin to talk about impeachment. But we can't confuse the fact that many of us are horrified by Trump's policies and by his temperament and by his desire to... when you talk about Trump, what gets me more than even his economic policies, which benefit the wealthy at the expense of everybody else, is he's doing literally what no other president, even conservative president, tried to do, trying to divide us up by the color of our skin or the country we were born in, or our religion or our sexual orientation or our gender. The president's job is to bring people together, not divide them up. But we will see how Mueller's investigation goes.
And what happens if Trump fires Mueller?
Then you're into a new playing field. Obstruction of justice is, in my mind, is an impeachable offense.
I guess following up, related to the 2019 agenda, is you're out there traveling the country a lot, talking to a lot of people. Do you think the Democrats will win the House? Do you think that it's going to happen? Is it too soon?
I have been to almost, 30 states in the country, most of them states that Trump won. Because I think it's important to talk to Trump's supporters and to say to them, look, we understand. There are no question about it. Some Trump supporters are racist, are sexist, are homophobes. No question about it. I don't think the majority of them are. I think these are people, in many cases, who feel the establishment has ignored them. And you know what? The establishment has ignored them. Both political parties have ignored them. They're working 2 or 3 jobs. Many of them don't have health care. They're worried to death about their children, who, everything being equal, will have a lower standard of living than they do. They are living in communities, believe it or not, where life expectancy is actually in decline, an ahistorical fact. So we're going out to those communities and say, look, we know you're hurting. But let's talk about policies that can improve life for you and your families. Don't let Trump divide us up by the color of our skin or where we were born.
And that's more than just the national anthem. That's sort of, it's the kind of the everyday.
Right. It is, to me, it's a little bit personal. My father came to this country from Poland at the age of 17, couldn't speak English, didn't have a nickel in his pocket, he never made any money. Neither of my parents ever went to college. But he ended up being the proudest American that you ever saw, for the same reason that millions of other people who came from abroad are proud Americans, for the opportunity that it gave him to do things he never could have done in the very, very poor community that he grew up in. That is what America is about. And either we stand together understanding that we are a common humanity, that you're black or you're Latino or you're Asian American or you are gay or you're women or you're men, that we have much more in common than the superficialities that divide us. And then you got a president who appeals to the basest instincts and say, oh, this person, is from Mexico. We got to hate that person. This person is black. Didn't, stand for the national anthem, trying to divide us up. So our job is to bring people together and then say, okay, how do we go forward? How do we guarantee health care to all? How do we make sure that our kids can afford to go to college? How do we deal with the global crisis of climate change? How do we work together with people, not devolve into tribalism and hatred? That's the challenge that we face.
We're getting a lot. I wasn't going to ask this question necessarily because I know you get asked it all the time, but we're getting a lot of questions on Twitter about your presidential plans for 2020. Will you?
I am shocked that you're asking. I really am.
You're
the first one.
Right, exactly. When will you decide?
At the appropriate time. Look, how's that for a good political answer? Good. Look, and I say this in all seriousness. Okay, number one, 2018, as I have said many times, is the most important midterm election in my lifetime, and I'm going to do everything that I can to see that we end one-party rule here in Washington, where the Republicans, right-wing extremist Republicans, control the Senate, the House, and the White House. That is what we have got to do. And second of all, what I'm going to do, as I mentioned earlier, as part of what we call the political revolution, is bring more and more people into the political process. If the United States had a voter turnout similar to what existed in many European countries, you would not have right-wing extremism dominating the American political process. So that's kind of and then I'm focusing on the important issues that need to be discussed. I've said this, I wrote a chapter in my book about media being focused on individuals and this, that, and some dumb thing that I may have said today, right, or that I said last week, rather than why are we the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people? Yeah. Do we think it is morally acceptable that a handful of billionaires own more wealth than the bottom half of the American people, American public? Those are issues we've got to start debating, and don't worry, believe me, there will be more than enough candidates, I'm quite confident, running for president. At the appropriate time, I will make that decision as to whether I do it or not. Right now, I am going to be running for re-election to the U.S. Senate in Vermont.
Someone asked online, you obviously almost won the Democratic nomination for president in 2016. You've criticized the Democratic establishment, and obviously it has had problems in the past. We talked about Perez and weighing into primaries. You're on the ballot in Vermont. You're in the Democratic primary, but then you're planning to not accept the Democratic nomination and get reelected as an independent, caucus with the Democrats. You've done this all your career. Like, why not just become a Democrat and change the Democratic Party?
Well, two reasons. Number one, in Vermont, since 1981, when I won election, defeating a Democrat, by the way, I have run as an independent. That's my commitment to the people of Vermont. Second of all, here is a very important political reality. According to polling that I have seen, there are more people who now consider themselves independents than do Democrats or Republicans. There is not a lot of love, frankly, for either the Democratic or Republican Party, and many people are discouraged with both, turning away from both. So I think it is not a bad idea to have somebody who says, yeah, I understand that. I am an independent. I have had problems, have to run against Democrats, but I want you, as independents to come into the Democratic primaries and transform the Democratic Party. So I think being an independent, speaking to the largest group of political people in this country, is not a bad thing.
I want to ask about one of those weighty issues you were talking about. You mentioned inequality, but the debt is another one.
Yeah.
The national debt's now over $20 trillion. The tax cuts are going to blow that up more than $1 trillion in red ink.
Yep.
I guess the question from Brooke on Twitter is, what is your plan to get the national debt under control? My generation is bearing the burden of the irresponsible federal budget. You obviously are the ranking member on the budget committee. What is your plan if you could wave your magic wand? Okay. You obviously want some big programs.
It's like $20 trillion is a heck of a lot of money, and even here in Washington, not to mention Vermont, it's a lot of money. But and here's the hypocrisy. and I will answer your question, is that you have Republicans who for decades, we can't afford to feed hungry children. We have a deficit. We can't provide health care. We can't rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. We have to, oh yes, we could give $1 trillion in tax breaks over 10 years to the top 1%. We can give huge tax breaks to profitable corporations who today pay almost nothing in taxes. We can afford to do that, but we can't afford to deal with the fact that we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth. That is extraordinary hypocrisy. All right, so how do you approach the problem? It's not going to be solved overnight, but it has to be understood that it is a real problem. The questioner is right, that younger generation is left with a huge burden. So I think at a time when the top 1/10 of 1% now owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%, when the very, very rich are becoming much richer, when corporations are enjoying record-breaking profits, yeah, we say to these large corporations, no, we're not going to lower your taxes, we're going to raise your taxes. No, for the wealthiest people in this country, we're going to increase the estate tax. We are going to increase personal income tax because you have the money. And we're going to use some of that money to reduce the deficit, but we're also going to use some of that money to rebuild our infrastructure and address the many crises facing this country. Look, we are evolving into a country where the people on top are doing unbelievably well. They live in gated communities, they drive around, fly around in their jet planes. They are worried that they only have $30 billion in the bank, they need even more. Big worry for them. And meanwhile, you have 40% of the American people, I don't know if you've seen this recent study done, I think it was by the Fed.
Yeah.
Over 40% of the American people cannot handle a $400 emergency. Their car breaks down. Their kid gets sick. They're going to have to borrow money to pay for that $400. You got families in this country, and I saw some of them in Disneyland, struggling to literally put food on the table for their children. So our struggle is to create an economy that works for all, not just the people on top, to really take on this corporate greed, which is unbelievable. It will, everybody wants to do well. I understand that. I want to do well. You want to do well. But when you are a family like the Koch brothers, worth $90 billion, I don't understand why you feel it necessary to try to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid in order to get more tax breaks. We got to deal with that culture. And by the way, we have an active social media, as you mentioned, my website. And it's interesting. We have young people who are millionaires. They're saying, we don't want a tax break. All right, we're doing just fine. We're more worried about the future of this country than a tax break for ourselves. So we got to change that culture of greed. We need serious tax reform. We need to deal with the deficit. We need to invest in our children, our vulnerable people, our infrastructure, healthcare.
There's a question from Mark on Twitter that is kind of, how do you respond to those who say your vision for America, including Medicare for all, tuition-free college, isn't affordable or realistic? Obviously you just talked about getting a lot of revenue from
this. Look, if we were a poor country, that would be a legitimate a legitimate question. We're the richest country in the history of the world. So I wanted to say, Mark was the question. Mark, right now, Germany provides free tuition in their universities, as do a number of other countries. I will never forget, I was in a meeting here in DC, and I said, Finland provides free college education. The kid jumped up in the back. He says, I'm from Finland. You're wrong. They don't provide free college. They pay us to go to college. Sorry, I'm corrected. All right, so the question is, do we ask, for example, Wall Street to pay a speculation fee, which would raise enough money to make public colleges and universities tuition free? Yeah, I think we do that. In terms of Medicare for all, despite the criticism I received from the Washington Post, among everybody else, at the end of the day, you will substantially drive down the cost of healthcare per capita through a single-payer healthcare system. Yes, you'll be paying more in taxes, but you're not going to be paying your private insurance premiums. And you will, as a middle-class person, be better off.
On entitlements, you mentioned some.
I hate that word.
Sorry. That's fair. The
Social
Security, Medicare.
Yeah.
It feels like next time Democrats are in power, Republicans are going to start talking about the need to cut Social Security.
They're talking about it today.
Is that going to happen? And
over my dead body, it will happen. Paul Ryan, and I'll give Paul credit. Paul was sitting right here. What he would tell you is, yeah, James, we did give $1 trillion in tax breaks to the top 1%. James, that's too bad. It drove up the deficit. But now that we have this $20 trillion debt, what we have to do, James, to balance that? We're going to have to cut Social Security. We're going to have to cut Medicaid. We're going to have to cut Medicare. Trump's budget, and I say this to Trump's supporters. When he ran for president, he said, I will not cut. I'm a different type of Republican. You remember that?
Right, I do.
I'm not Paul Ryan.
He said it a lot.
I'm not going to cut Social Security. I'm not going to cut Medicare. I'm not going to cut Medicaid. Check out his budget. $1 trillion cut in Medicaid, $500 billion in Medicare over a 10-year period, cuts to the Social Security Disability Fund. He lied to the American people. In my state of Vermont, you got elderly people who are trying to get by on $12,000 or $13,000 a year Social Security. You tell me how a human being, if you're 90 years of age, gets by on $13,000. I don't know how they keep their homes warm. I don't know how they afford the outrageously high cost of prescription drugs. Don't know how they do that. And to cut back on Social Security, how vulgar, how obscene. Cut back on Social Security for people who make $13,000 a year and give tax breaks to billionaires. That is the moral issue that we have got to deal with. And the overwhelming majority of the American people are in disagreement with that. And the only way that a Ryan or anybody else can come forward is with the understanding that it is the Koch brothers and other billionaires who will support their campaigns if they go forward in that direction.
You mentioned some victories that progressives have had in the Deep South. You mentioned, some cities in Mississippi and
Jackson, Mississippi is a very progressive mayor.
Right. The moderates in the party will say, Ralph Northam was the less progressive candidate in Virginia last year. Doug Jones ran as a relative moderate. Connor Lamb won in Pennsylvania firing an AK-47. Those are the kind of people who win who aren't embracing these ideas.
Look, there are 435 congressional districts, and they're all different. And candidates have got to assess how their constituents feel. What I believe in general is that if you deal with the issues facing working families, who at the end of the day are the majority of people in every congressional district, virtually every congressional district, and you say, is health care a right? People will say yes. Can you afford to send your kids to college? No, we can't. Should women get equal pay for equal work? Yes, they should. Should we raise the minimum wage to a living wage? Yes. Is climate change real? And should we transform our energy system? Yes, we should. Is it acceptable that we have more people in jail than any other country, including 400,000 people in jail today, James? Do you know why they're in jail? Because they can't afford their bail, cash bail. You got people in jail because they can't afford to pay their traffic ticket. Anybody in America think that makes sense? They don't. Should we have immigration reform? 80% of the American people said in polling that we should provide legal protection to the young people in the DACA program, and a majority of the people in this country believe we need a path towards citizenship for undocumented people. These are not radical ideas. These are ideas that the American people believe in, not to mention dealing with income and wealth inequality. So I think in general, I'm not going to say that program will work maybe in every district, but in general, I think when you have a program that makes sense to working people, that speaks to the idealism and the economic needs of young people, that is a program that is not only good public policy, it is good politics. It wins elections.
Excellent. Well, we're running out of time. And Senator Sanders, thank you so much for being here. Thanks to our audience. Thanks to everyone tuning in the live stream. We'll have Steve Scalise, who has a very different ideological perspective than you, in 2 weeks, which hopefully you guys will return for that. So with that, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You can get up.